hopefully everyone's connected now. And if you're, the slide on the screen can let you know if you're in the right session or not. This is Designing for Chaos, the design process behind Olivero. So I'll get started here. Welcome. I'm Jared Ponchot, and my colleague Jen Wachowski is also with me and will be speaking as well. Jen and I have been working together for a number of years now at Lullabot. We're both designers. We do UX and UI design work mostly within large-scale Drupal projects, often larger design systems kinds of projects. Uh-oh, my slides won't work. Here we go. We both work together at a company called Lullabot, like I mentioned. If you're not familiar with Lullabot, we're a strategy design development agency with a legacy of expertise in Drupal and large-scale CMS projects. I joined Lullabot in April of 2010, which feels like a long time ago now. I remember back then, Jen Simmons was starting the Bartik project. This was a month or two before I joined Lullabot. I remember watching it from afar and being very interested. Bartik served a lot of people for a lot of years now. That was a decade ago. So if any of you watching this today have contributed to Bartik, were involved in that process, or contributed over the years, pat yourself on the back right now. That is quite an achievement for anything to last that long digitally. So thanks to all who laid the groundwork for that. Speaking of people who laid groundwork, the germ of the idea for this Olivero project came from my colleagues, Putra Bonacorsi and Mike Herschel at DrupalCon Seattle. Mike's actually here with us today and is going to be moderating for us as we get to the questions time. Angie Byron and I think Lowry Escala were in a hotel lobby at DrupalCon Seattle talking with Mike and Putra and having a conversation about what constitutes a great CMS theme. And that conversation led to Putra and Mike kind of wondering at the fact that there was actually no current project for developing a new theme for Drupal 9. So Dries had also mentioned in his keynote from DrupalCon Seattle that while experts still love Drupal, beginners or CMS newcomers still have some negative connotations. And a key aspect of that is the fact that the out-of-the-box experience includes a theme design that's now a decade old. So Putra and Mike started by creating a few just simple initial goals that they had that made them interested in working on it. So they wanted a theme that felt more current, potentially for the next 5 years. Seemed like a reasonable goal. 10 years like the last one is a little bit of a stretch. They wanted the theme to support commonly used Drupal functionality like second level navigation, embedded media, layout builder, and more of these new things that are in Drupal now that weren't there 10 years ago. And they wanted the theme to be to meet really high accessibility standards. Drupal has very stringent accessibility standards, and we wanted to meet those with flying colors. And it was kind of at that point where they had framed what they were hoping to do or why they were interested when they reached out to Jen, who talked with me about it. And then we decided we were going to pretend like we knew what we were doing, designing an open source CMS theme. So this talk is going to attempt to answer kind of a handful of things. Who are we? Why did we do this? How did we do this? And what specifically did we do here? And the good news is you're already here. So we're flying through this. I'm going to cover about 10 minutes on the sort of the approach and philosophy, and Jen's going to jump in with some more specifics. And then we're going to try to have some time at the end for questions. So I want to start by framing some of the unique challenges that we faced right out of the gate. The two key questions for any design project is, who is your audience and who are your stakeholders? These are fundamental things for any design process, and the work that Jen and I normally do together provides pretty clear answers to these questions usually. When you're designing a theme that anyone can use for nearly any kind of site that they're making with an open source CMS, how you define things like the audience you're designing for and what feedback and approval processes are going to be like is tricky. How you solve for this can actually end up creating new problems if you're not careful. So there's two potentially alluring approaches to this problem that are actually each problematic, and we kind of identified or talked about that at the beginning. The first problematic approach is just to try to include everything for anyone, thereby making it unwieldy and unusable for everyone. You just can't include everything. We knew we weren't going to be able to. The needs are too varied. We wanted to have some focus as we created. Now, the second problematic approach, sometimes in response to that for this kind of a process, is to design for the average and wind up designing for no one specifically. So this is sometimes referred to as the average man problem. If you're not familiar with this, back in World War II, we were coming to grips as a nation in the United States, especially with the fact that the US military had spent decades designing and building airplane cockpits and controls for what it called the average man. And there's a really long backstory to this that's fascinating and great. If you're interested in that sort of thing, there's a podcast called 99% Invisible. They did a great story on it called On Average. You can look for that episode. There's also a book called The End of Average that's really interesting about this whole thing. But by World War II, what they began realizing was that taking averages of all Air Force personnel measurements, that gave you an approximation of this average man, things like height, weight, arm length. But it turned out that no one pilot matched any of those averages. There was not a single pilot in the Air Force who was average. And this led to the design thinking behind modern cockpits, where we have things today like adjustable seats and adjustable yokes and adjustable pedals even. So in designing Olivero, we also had to work to figure out what features and controls would need to be adjustable, if you will. So what was our approach? Jen's gonna, like I said, get into more specifics in terms of the things we actually did. And that'll be fun because she's gonna show you actual designs from the process. But at a high level, I'm gonna try to frame out our approach and philosophy. So first, we established some design principles. This helped us define success in a way that was easy to remember and could remain true regardless of what we learned about our audience and stakeholders along the way. Our principles were that, above all, we wanted to design something that was simple, modern, focused, and flexible. Simple just meant we wanted to avoid unnecessary visual elements, colors, effects, and complexity wherever possible. Modern meant we wanted to take advantage of the capabilities and strengths of modern browsers and interaction patterns that really didn't exist 10 years ago when Bartik was created. Focused meant we wanted to embrace high contrast, saturated color, negative space to draw the eye to what's most important and try to design defaults for the 80%. And flexible just meant we wanted to provide options and overrides to account for varied needs and preferences. So we then worked to zero in on what we could say about our audience and their sites, the people who would use this theme. And when you're designing a default theme for an open source CMS like Drupal, there's an ocean of things you just can't know about the people who are going to use it and the sites that they're going to create. But there were things that we felt were safe to say. These were things like they were probably going to be somewhat new to Drupal. People using a default theme often are. They may not have programming or design skills, because if you're using the default theme, you likely don't have access to developers or people to help you craft your own. Because of both of those things, they may also have simpler content models using just core Drupal content types for the most part. And last, despite all of that, things like the length of content and the number of menu items and those kinds of things, those may vary wildly, even if they all were using the same core content types. So we also worked to define our stakeholders. We needed to answer a few key questions. Just who are these stakeholders? Who's going to provide feedback, when and how? What do we want from them, and what kind of feedback are we looking for? And then what will approval look like? How do we know when we're done? Who will approve which designs and how? So I've already mentioned the challenge we had of our real stakeholders being lots of people who may eventually use this theme, and a broad Drupal community who cares a lot about it, but we needed some sort of approach to rein that in a bit, at least initially. And our approach was to first establish a proxy group. We assembled a group of various core maintainers from the Drupal community, as well as our team of designers and developers working on the project, that we could use initially to help begin the review and refinement process. And the goal here was to do as much due diligence as possible to weed out as many of the problems and issues with our design ideas as possible, so that we could put something more solid in front of the larger community for feedback. Next, we tested and then just continued to iterate based on those tests with that group. We had a lot of help from our proxy group with things like accessibility testing along the way, so that we were able to do a lot of refinement and find a lot of the things early in the design process. That still is ongoing to this day. There's still accessibility tests and still design refinements happening right now. But we were able to catch a lot early on, and weeding out a lot of problems helped us not waste the broader community's time when we put things in front of them. We also knew we wanted to eventually engage the broader community for feedback though. So we did some work to define the kind of feedback we were looking for and what our timeline targets would be to help give people deadlines for providing feedback once we put it in front of them. And once we'd done a good bit of refinement in the design process and defined the kind of feedback we were looking for the broader community, we published our progress and those guidelines and continued our refinement process based on that broader community feedback. One thing that felt like a success was the community feedback did not feel like an overwhelming onslaught of problems and complaints. The community provided really great insights and helped catch a few things that hadn't been addressed yet to help get our designs closer to done. So that was a kind of a flyover of some of the key challenges we faced in our approach. But the really fun stuff is what we actually did within that process. Like, how did we identify the look and feel of what we wanted to achieve? And how did we collaborate and refine and establish that look and feel? And even better, what were the designs like along the way? So now for the more exciting part, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jen Witkowski, who's going to share some of those details. I think if I undo my screen share here, she'll be able to do hers.
There we go. Can you see my screen, Jared?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the design process and how we approach the visual design for Olivero. So the big question that we had to get answered as designers was basically, what are we designing? What does this theme actually have to do? It was important for us to understand the scope and restrictions of the project and things that we could change versus things that were nice to have versus things we couldn't even touch. And we worked closely with our developers, which were Putra and Mike, to help achieve this. So what we did is we basically created a list that captured all the components in Bartik and reviewed them with the developers to fully understand what we could change. We also captured all the different states and all the different variations of those components could appear in. So this is what we created. It was basically a paper doc that we created in Dropbox. As you can see here, it's nothing fancy. But what we did is we started off with Bartik, took a bunch of screenshots of all the different components that could appear in Bartik, all the different states that those components could appear in, and just dropped them into this paper doc. We then reviewed this with Mike and Putra so we could fully understand what we had to include and think about in the system. Once we had this complete, we could move on into the visual phase. One thing to note is that when we had first started working in the visual phase, we were working with stakeholders across multiple time zones who already had pretty full days. We also had a pretty aggressive deadline. So we had to shorten the visual research phase by prioritizing what the big questions were and shorten the amount of design reviews that we had with stakeholders. So the question for us for designers was, what should the new theme look like? And we had to work really closely with our stakeholders to help answer this question. And since we didn't have a lot of time to spend on answering this question, we used an exercise called the spectrum analysis exercise, where stakeholders could go in and complete this exercise on their own time by a specific deadline that we had set. So you may be asking yourself, well, what is the spectrum analysis exercise? Well, it's a great exercise that our team uses to help figure out what the client is thinking when it comes to a voice and tone, look and feel of a website, or in this case, the theme. So what you do is you create a sliding scale. On one end is an adjective that could describe the look and feel of the site. And on the other end is another adjective that usually conflicts with the first. One thing to note is that both adjectives need to be positive. Otherwise, this exercise doesn't work because stakeholders generally don't want to choose a negative adjective to associate their website with. A great example here is the one right at the top, formal and casual. If you felt like the website should feel more formal, you put a tag more towards the formal side. If you felt like that the website should feel more casual, you put a tag more towards the casual side. The end result of this exercise is that it forces stakeholders to choose an adjective and helps initiate some really great discussions around the why. Because as designers, it's for us to fully understand the why so we can make better design decisions moving forward. And since we couldn't conduct this in person, we used a tool called Envision to conduct this exercise. And it worked out really well because stakeholders can go in and use the commenting function to put a point on the scale. And then other stakeholders, designers, developers can go in and actually leave other comments and start a discussion. So based on the spectrum analysis, we identified the following keywords to help establish the voice and tone. So we have formal, light and bright, contemporary, professional, approachable, novel, cool, familiar, and high contrast. Once we had this set, we combined them with our adjectives with our design principles in order to complete our research documentation. Once we felt like we had this in a good spot, we could start exploring visual approaches. One thing to note is that our team tries to keep the design principles and adjectives in front of mind while we're designing. So we'll use things like note cards, Post-its, whiteboards, vision boards to help remind us of the design principles and voice and tone while we start exploring the visual approaches. So the next step was to actually start thinking about the visual design. And our team uses something called Zoom mocks to explore different visual approaches to designs. And what a Zoom mock is it's basically you choose a wireframe, then you choose a small section of that wireframe, and then you start exploring style in that specific section. It's an alternative to style tiles or element collages that we feel just works better for our team and our process. Our team usually creates 2 to 4 Zoom mocks, each representing a completely different style or variations in a specific style. And if you want to learn more about Zoom mocks, the details behind how to use them, when to use them, and how to use them, there's an article that I wrote that gets a little bit more into the nitty-gritty details about them. So these are some of the Zoom mocks that we had created for Olivero. As you can see here, we explored approaches that were a little bit more traditional, like the ones you see on the left, and ones that were a little bit more modern, like the ones you see on the right. Once we felt like we had these in a good spot, we reviewed them with stakeholders, and they chose an approach to move forward with some, small minor revisions. One thing to note is that our team wasn't looking for an official sign off of a finalized style. We would have been in a much larger feedback loop that the timeline really didn't account for. What we were looking for more from our stakeholders was for them to kind of choose a style to keep moving forward with the understanding that the design would evolve and change as we extended to other pages and components. Once we had our Zoom mocks complete, it was time to start thinking about the design system. But before I get into that, I just want to restate some of the challenges that we had to keep in mind while thinking about the design system. Accessibility was our #1 priority. The theme had to be WCAG AA accessible, and we had to keep that in mind while we were designing out components and extending the design system to pages. We also had to think about the nice to haves versus the must haves. We had a lot of great ideas, but unfortunately they couldn't have been implemented in time with the tight deadline that we had. We also had to understand who our audience was and their attention. There was a lot that they could do with this theme, and we wanted to give them as many options as possible. And finally, typography. We had to find a font that used the SIL open font license, so it was compatible with the Drupal.org distribution packaging requirements. It also had to provide a wide variety of font weights and fit with the overall theme of feeling modern. So in the end, we chose Metropolis for our sans serif and Laura for our serif font. So now I am going to give you guys a guided tour of the design here. I'm going to switch screens real quick. So usually I would do this with video, but video tends to lag in Zoom. So I am going to take you right into the Figma files, which is actually pretty exciting. I also have my screen over to my left with my Figma file. So I'll be kind of looking over to the left a little bit to make sure that I'm actually pointing at the right thing as I'm talking about it. So, yeah, one thing to note is when we had first started extending the design system to pages, we started off with 2 pages. We started off with the landing page, the default out of the box experience, and the article page. And the reasoning behind this is we wanted to explore the contrast of what the theme would look like with minimal content, like what you would see out of the box when you first installed this theme, versus with a lot of content, and make sure that we were accounting for everything that we needed to. So with the default out of the box experience, our main goal was to rework and organize the content so it was a lot more helpful to get a user started. With the article page, what we did is we actually mocked up a blog article that basically touted the Olivero theme. And this allowed us to work out more complex patterns, including things like the refined typography system, like what our H1s would look like, what our quotations would look like, but also we could start thinking about imagery and image ratios, what images would look like floated left and right with captions. And then components like tables, list items, and more complex patterns such as tags and our commenting system. So there was a lot that we could work out in this one page where we could really quickly take out some of the styles that we had established in this page and start applying them to other pages. The next thing that we focused on is our header. And our header was pretty complex because it had to be pretty flexible, especially when it came to the navigation. So as you see here, we have 5 links. These are all pretty short. This is like the best case scenario and most likely wouldn't happen. So we had to think about, well, what would happen if a content editor uploaded 15 links in their navigation and they had a pretty long links? How does this work? So what we did is we created a max width with the navigation. And when that navigation hit that max width, it would actually roll up into a hamburger nav. And this would allow content editors to not be limited to the amount of links that they could upload in their navigation. And those links could also be pretty long if they needed them to be that way. This pattern too, once we had this established, we could pretty quickly extend this to tablet and mobile with this hamburger menu component. One of the other things that I do want to note is that we also established a neat interaction that when on scroll down with the header would actually wrap up into this hamburger nav. And then the user could click that hamburger nav at any time to extend and see the navigation itself. And we just thought that this interaction made the theme feel a little bit more modern. When it came to branding, users can upload different types of logos. They could be different colors, different sizes. They could also just not have a logo and type in the name of their website. And we needed to account for all these different variations. So what we did is we created different background colors that the logos and branding could appear on. So for lighter logos and branding, or for darker logos and branding, we have lighter colors. So we have like a lighter gray background and a white background. But if you have a lighter logo, you have a darker background, such as this blue color here. And this is just showing that it works with logos and with typography. So once we had the header complete, we then focused on the listing page. And our main goal for the listing page was basically to ensure that users could very quickly scan through this page. So what we did is we made titles large and prominent, and secondary content such as descriptions and tags became less prominent and smaller. When it came to the editor tabs, we kept this pretty simple and just updated the style of these so it fit more with the theme. We had some ideas around this that I'll review a little bit later in this presentation that unfortunately couldn't have been implemented in time. And then finally, forms. Actually, forms is still an ongoing work in progress. So our big challenge with forms is making them accessible while also making sure that they fit with the theme of feeling modern. And we've been going back and forth with accessibility experts on these. There's some updates that I made on these actually just last week that aren't shown here, where we are trying to figure out how we can darken the background color of the form field, but also figuring out like how we have to darken the placeholder text and make the focus dates a little bit more noticeable so they pass accessibility testing. So now I just want to go into ideas that we had scratched. So these are ideas that didn't make it. This is kind of like the blooper reels of the presentation. So with the editor tabs, these are the ones that we are moving forward with. Started working on editor tabs, we had actually started with a much darker approach that you see here. We got some feedback that, this wasn't quite working. It felt too prominent. So we had actually explored editor tabs that were pinned to the left and right-hand side to make them less prominent. And we felt like this was a great idea, but unfortunately, there was too much involved with this in order to get this to work properly with the timeline that we had. With the sidebar, so we have a default out of the box sidebar that is floated to the right, but eventually down the line, we may want to include an option for users to be able to float the sidebar to the right or left. So we just included a comp to make sure that the sidebar worked. So if we were to roll out that functionality, there would be minimal rework with that design. And finally, search. So search, this is the design that we are moving forward with search in the Olivero theme. But when we had first started exploring search, we took a much lighter approach. We got some feedback that this actually didn't feel like a search box. It felt like it was actually part of the theme design. So we had done a little bit of exploration around search to include underlines to make it feel more like a search box. But in the end, this one, we moved forward with this one because it was the more simplistic one that fit with the theme. And finally, I just want to review a little bit of how we documented Olivero when it came to design documentation. Design documentation is really important because as designers, we sometimes work pretty quickly. We copy and paste, colors, typography doesn't get updated from page to page. And developers, as they're going through and grabbing styles, they sometimes run across these discrepancies. And they're like, well, is it this color red or is it this color red? And so we want to create this single source of truth for developers or designers who are onboarding onto the project that they could go to answer those questions. So when we document our design system, we usually focus on typography, the grid systems, styles, scales and spacing, components, and all their various different states. We also create design documentation in two different spots. So we have design documentation in Figma in the form of a library. And this library includes things like styles for typography and color, but also has a component library where you could really quickly pull components from that library to assemble pages. We also have design documentation in Google Docs. And Google Docs holds our more detailed design documentation, details around things like scale and spacing and our grid system. So I'm just going to really quickly show some of the design documentation that we had created in Figma. So this is our typography system in Figma. So we list out all our different type sizes, including line height, letter spacing, text transform. And these are in the form of styles in the Figma library. So the user can just access this through a drop down, all these typography choices. And then we have the colors, and these are in the form of swatches in our Figma design system. And then finally, just reviewing some of the components that we have included in the component library in Figma. So we have, for example, our header here and all the different states that the header can appear in. So we have, what our header looks like when it's in the collapsed hamburger nav. And then also ensuring that we also have these all documented out for mobile. So I am going to go back to my presentation here because I want to talk a little bit about what's next for Olivero, because we are in a really exciting time right now with the theme. So right now we're undergoing usability and accessibility testing, and we're doing this in partnership with the National Federation of the Blind. And Kat Shaw, who is one of our teammates, is heading up that endeavor, and results have been really positive so far, which make us all really happy. From a development standpoint, we're aiming for beta level stability so we can include it as a default theme in the 9.2 release. And this is round about June 2021. And if you want a little bit more details about this, I would highly recommend reaching out to Mike and Putra because they are the lead developers that are trying to get this in. And I know Putra has an actual talk later on this week that I would highly recommend attending. We also have thinking about dark mode. So dark mode has been on our radar for a while. And it's something that as we get this in a good spot and it gets our main goal of this getting in as the default theme is completed, I think dark mode is going to be the next thing that we kind of tackle as our big endeavor. And then finally, a color switcher for the theme. So right now the theme only comes with that default Drupal blue, and it doesn't work with all different types of branding. For example, if you have a logo that's red, it tends to clash with that color. So we've been thinking about a color switcher that introduces a more neutral palette. So that way it can work with a wide variety of different colors when it comes to branding. So that is it for today. There's a lot more that we could talk about when it comes to Olivero, but unfortunately we are on a limited, we have limited time here today. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the project, highly recommend visiting these two links. The one on the top will get you to the Drupal.org page with the talks a little bit about the initiative, the history. You can access the Figma files that I actually just showed today if you're a little bit more interested about digging into the design. If you want to get involved or just have questions in general, I highly recommend joining the Slack channel, which is the second link below. So yeah, I guess now I'm going to open it to Mike, who's going to be our moderator for today, and he can help moderate any questions.
Yeah, well, that was really good, Jenna and Jared. Thank you for that. So right now we have, looks like we have like 3 questions, and then I wrote down a list of questions as I was thinking about stuff, and we have right now about 11 minutes left. So the first question is from Mike Gifford. What has been the hardest accessibility challenge that you have had thus far? And I'm guessing this is related directly to the design process.
So I'm going to
forms, Jen.
Yeah, I was going to say forms.
Yeah, that's the one that continually vexes, because just when we think that we've got it all ironed out, we discover a new potential challenge with it. And I think that forms, especially in my opinion, are the tricky thing. Is to visual design is used to communicate meaning, and it should be, that's not a problem, but creating a visual style and maintaining consistency while also ensuring that the meaning works, for all the states is actually not an easy thing. The other thing that jumps to my mind is just like there was early iterations of our design. We had these small label styles that were kind of all caps and type that was tracked out a bit. And it was intended for things like short labels, like share this, or things that would be not very many characters and words. But then over time, the more we examined what could be overridden in Drupal, the more we realized there was no way to ensure that these things would always be short. And so we were sort of hamstrung in terms of the variety of type styles that we could use in a design process, not knowing, how people would use it. So other things, Jen?
Now, one thing that I did want to mention is that when we had initially started thinking about forms, we had looked towards Claro, which is the admin theme initiative that's going on now, because they already were further down the process with a lot of this stuff. So we could actually take a look what Clara had done with forms and, you know, use it as inspiration for some of the form work that we had done for Olivero. So.
Cool. I also want to mention that I answered a question in the chat from Nick Borda. He was asking what license do the fonts need to have to be compatible with Drupal.org. And the answer to that is the SIL Open Font License 1.0 and 1.2. And I left a hyperlink, although it didn't link, a URL that showed the Drupal.org packaging requirement. And once again, thanks, Mike Gifford, for answering that. And Mike Gifford is one of the Drupal core accessibility maintainers, and he's been really instrumental in this project. So thanks, Mike. And he has also like helped coordinate with the National Federation of the Blind with testing and everything like that. So that's been pretty awesome. Kind of a process question from Miro. Mike, I'm not even going to pronounce the last name. Do you have a decision documentation or log process or anything like that happened? You can say no.
Well, I was going to say Mike might be able to fill in whether I'm missing anything. This was in hindsight. This was actually something that I had thought about was something like I think I would do that, because we were all working in our margins, working on this project. And therefore we'd get requests, we'd go back and forth, we'd iterate, and everything was done kind of rapidly in margins. It probably would have been really useful if we'd had some way to more explicitly track changes. There's obviously change tracking from the standpoint of like, there is version history there in our Figma files. As the project progressed, we did end up having a lot of things happen within Drupal issues as well. So there's a decision tree there, but I'm not aware of early on whether there's any kind of explicit canonical place where we have like a decision tree for each thing, and it'd be nice if we had thought of that at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of our discussions were over Slack, and then we had a number of Zoom discussions with the stakeholders where, you know, we went over some of the designs and stuff. All right. So more of a development question. So I'll answer this is, what is the plan for the stable release, including sub theming? Is it going to be before D10? And so that's more of a development question. I'm going to answer that pretty quickly. So sub theming requires like almost like a stable, you know, markup. You know, like right now we're in the process of changing our markup to fit like proper BEM standards and things like that. That's one of the reasons it's not yet stable. So like as soon as we explicitly support sub theming, that means we can't change CSS class names in the DOM or anything like that, because it could break, you know, sub theme CSS. So we're going to hold that off as long as possible, basically, but we're probably going to officially support it at some point. There's no reason you can't sub theme right now. It'll work exactly like you expect, but we might be changing around HTML. And is it going to be before D10? You know, maybe, probably, honestly. Although Drupal 10 is coming out in 2 years, so it's going to be pretty quick. A question from Suchi, Garg. Accessibility versus a sleeky look. How do you make a client understand that balance? You know, how do you make a client understand between like a really good look versus accessibility? And I have thoughts on this too.
Well, and for this use case, we didn't really have to do that because out of the bat, it just had to be accessible. Like it wasn't something that we had to convince anybody that it had to be accessible. But when it comes to past clients, just educating them on why it has to be accessible. You know, like if you're a university or government, I think there's actually laws where they have to have an accessible website in place, and the clients may not know of that. So just, you know, making sure that they fully understand the reasons on why you're pushing accessibility. So. Yeah,
and I'll say that's something that we're still learning as well in terms of beyond Olivero, where we had the benefit of it. You know, this has to be. We don't have a choice here. So I think that those things aren't necessarily always in direct tension as well. I feel like where we landed so far and where we continue to work to refine, I think we are trying to strike a balance where we're not kind of hating the aesthetic of things like forms after we're done making them accessible. I think it's just a lot of work back and forth to try to land somewhere. I think that ultimately helping educate, though, like Jen said, helping people understand that if these don't actually work for everyone in the way that they use them, then they're not really doing you any help. So
Yeah, I'd like to add on that. I agree with you. Like, being accessible does not mean being ugly. You know, you can have both. And Olivero, like, one of the goals of Olivero is to prove that we can be accessible, beautiful, and sleek all at the same time, you know. So I don't think it's an either or. All right, next question. Are there plans to replace the font with one supporting accents? I did not even know that we didn't support accents, honestly. We need to file an issue for that. So if there's if there are issues with the fonts or something like that, we need to go ahead and file some core issues, and at that point we can take care of those, you know. It's especially like maybe like give us some text that we can copy and paste in or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought Laura, which is our main font that's used for body copy, definitely does, but I could be wrong about that. So this
it might have been
know.
Also the packaging that we got too, because like when you grab the web font files, you can subset them, so you can do just like, you know, certain like Western glyphs and stuff like that, and that won't have the appropriate like maybe all the characters. And I don't believe that we did that, but it's possible that we did.
But if we have to choose a different font to make sure that we're supporting languages, we will. So we'll have to look into that.
Yeah, we'll do it. How user-friendly was Figma for your stakeholders?
It was very user-friendly, and I think that's one of the reasons why we chose to use Figma. The great thing about Figma is it has a web-based program, so you just send stakeholders a link. They don't have to install anything in their computer. It's all browser-based. And then you can actually see other people's cursors in there. You can give, I mean, anybody editor access too. So like Mike could have editor access and he could go in his browser and actually change things around. I don't know if we'd want to do that, Mike, but
what are you talking about?
But it also works very well for Jared and I too. Because, you know, we could actually design together, not actually being in the same room or, you know, sharing the same file. So,
yeah, we did a lot of live design with team members where we were moving things, you know, while discussing.
Yep.
I believe there's a way in Figma where you can like have the user track your mouse. So like if you move somewhere else in a document, they follow you too.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and to me that's a pretty cool feature. So I don't even know how to turn that on, but like, you know, if you have a bunch of different panes or whatever you call them with Figma, it's useful to have the client follow around what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So we have about 57 seconds left. And so this is actually a good time right here. I'm not going to even answer any of my questions here.
You can ask us later, Mike.
Yeah, my questions were amazing, by the way, but we just have to assume that.
Awesome.
Anything else that you two want to say?
No, just thank you. And, you know, feel
thanks,
free
everybody.
to reach out to us if you have any questions. So.
Yep. All right. Well,
enjoy your DrupalCon.
Yeah, that's it for the session. Oh, I have a couple things to say. There's a couple more presentations for Olivero. Pucha Bonacorsi, one of the leads, is going to give a session on the the genesis of this, and she's also going to be in the Drupal leads keynote talking about this too. And I don't know the times right now because I wasn't prepared, but just look at those in the schedule. Thank you.